Welcome. Thanks for watching this dairy video brought to you by DairyXNet. Today, Dr. Michael Overton joins us to discuss economic considerations associated with raising replacement dairy heifers. For alerts on new articles, videos, and resources in DairyXNet, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook or sign up for our newsletter. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel here on YouTube. Links to all can be found within this video's description. Today's presenter, Dr. Michael Overton, received his BS and DVM from North Carolina State University and completed a dairy production medical residency and his Master's of Preventative Veterinary Medicine degree in California. In his career, he has practiced veterinary medicine, worked as a dairy production medical specialist at UC Davis, and served as a professor of dairy production medicine and was Chief of Service for the Food Animal Program at the University of Georgia College of Veterinary Medicine. In May 2012, Dr. Overton left his position at the University of Georgia to assume a dairy analytics position with Elanco Knowledge Solutions. In this role, Dr. Overton is responsible for developing economic models and tools and providing consulting services to dairies and their consultants. Join me in welcoming Dr. Overton to talk about the economic considerations associated with raising replacement dairy heifers.
All right, well, thank you for joining the webinar today. As mentioned, the title of this is Economic Considerations Regarding the Raising of Dairy Replacement Heifers, and I want to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Kevin Duvetter, former economist at Kansas State, who's now my colleague at Elanco, for his generous help in working this project. So just as a way of introduction, replacement heifer raising is typically second or third largest cost of production on dairies. By far, number one, most expensive one is feed. So typically heifers come in second or possibly third behind labor. And heifer raising commonly accounts for, depending on the estimate, somewhere between 6 and 14% of total production costs for dairies. If we look at some of the published estimates that are out there on the cost of raising heifers, there are two I want to just mention briefly. The first is from Jason Karzes at Cornell University. He looked at 17 dairies that had an average age at first calving of about 23 months. And if we assumed a wet calf, newborn heifer calf value of $150, and an interest rate or cost of capital of 7%, he found that the average total investment per animal at calving was a little over $2,200, with the interquartile range of $1,860 to $2,263. So again, that's 17 dairies in the Northeast. In a similar type of contemporary paper, this is in 2013, and this one's out of Wisconsin, they looked at surveying tie stall, freestall dairies, and also heifer growers. They too assumed a wet calf value of $150 per animal, but they had an interest cost in their calculations of 4.5%. And they further broke their cost estimates down into basically two time periods in the raising phase. First, that of the calf up through weaning, and then from post-weaning through calving, so the calf and the heifer phases. And then again, they broke these out by the source, whether it's a tie stall dairy, a freestall dairy, or heifer grower. And you can see the estimates here. We have a range for the calf cost of a little over $400 to about $527 for the dairy operations. And then for the heifer phase, we see a low of $1,519 from the heifer growers. And then tie stall and freestall, again, similar at a little over $1,950. So if we look at the average by source, the tie stall and freestall dairies were both very similar in cost, $2,482 versus $2,490, and the heifer grower was significantly lower in cost, $1,930, but the average cost here in this paper was $2,377. So we can see that all of these estimates are similar in terms of roughly ranging from about $1,930 up to a little over almost $2,500. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's obvious that the costs will vary based on the year in which we look at data, because feed costs and other costs can vary quite a bit across time. But the other thing I really want to point out that I've found is pretty consistent is, for most situations, the actual cost, when all expenses are considered, is quite a bit higher than most producers tend to think of. In other words, $2,200, $2,300, and I think if you ask most producers around the same time period, they probably would have selected a value that was significantly lower than that. So the objectives of this project was to try to carefully examine the economic cost of replacement heifer raising, and the approach we took was to compare a more conventional, kind of an old-style traditional raising approach versus a bit more intensive approach. Now, the housing and feeding systems were modeled primarily around more of a Midwestern system, but there's blends of systems in here. The cost considerations that we looked at, we can break these down into categories. So obviously we have things like feed, we have on-farm labor, we have the health and vet med cost, and contained within the health and vet med cost would be things like vaccines, and there's a vaccine protocol in here. There are the different disease costs as well as any veterinary costs that might be incurred. There are breeding costs, costs associated with culling animals, whether it's due to an animal dying or an animal that might be sold. There are housing costs, and that includes bedding. There's also interest costs. And by interest costs, what we're referring to is the cost of capital associated with making an investment from which you don't receive any benefit until later. So for example, if we pay to rear a milk-fed calf, the money that we're spending to raise that calf could have an alternative investment option. So we could put that money elsewhere, whether it's buying another dairy cow or dairy cows, whether it's investing in a new tractor, whatever the case may be. So when we look at investments into the heifer raising operation, we have to consider the time cost of money, because money not spent here could be spent elsewhere. And so that's what the interest cost refers to. And finally, we have the wet calf cost. Many producers fail to account for the value of the calf that was born on their farm and enters their raising period. But we always have to remember, if that calf did not go into their replacement operation, the calf could have been sold as a young calf or sold at different stages along the way. So we have to consider the opportunity cost of that calf. And the other thing that many people fail to do, unfortunately, we need to account for expenses in all these categories that are incurred by heifers that either die or sold prior to reaching that replacement, that springy heifer or that fresh heifer time period. Now, the model is simply a spreadsheet model, and it's designed to take a partial budget approach to mimic a conventional versus an intensive heifer program. Now, a few highlights in terms of the differences between these two programs. The intensive program has more nutrient-dense milk replacer. It feeds more milk replacer. It has a higher metabolizable protein level in the starter, the grower rations. In fact, all the rations up until the very end tend to have a little bit more metabolizable protein allowable gain. Heifers in the intensive program do consume more total feed per day per heifer, and this is largely driven by the fact that we've got larger animals once we start the heifers growing. It's assumed that the intensive program will have lower morbidity, so less sickness occurring, and less deaths than the conventional program because of the improved nutritional status. And likewise, we end up seeing a lower age at first breeding and consequently a lower age at first calving or freshening. And then finally, the thing that we'll expect to see from a more intensive program is a higher future milk production because of both improved health and some other impacts on that young growing heifer. The final cost that I'll report to you today is based on the value at calving. So it's actually the cost per heifer that actually calves. And that's a really important point to remember as we move forward. Now, in terms of the feeding system, pre-weaning rations are composed of milk replacer and starter grains, and the actual intakes and responses are based upon published research. So this is not something we're actually modeling to try to understand the impact of per se. We're taking published research and plugging it into the model. Post-weaning, the rations are built using the Cornell net carbohydrate protein system. They're designed to meet the growth targets by stage, and the intakes are actually predicted intakes based on the size and the energy characteristics of each feed being fed. Housing, we've got what we refer to as age-appropriate housing. Young calves are in hutches. When they're weaned, they go into small indoor group pens, and then they go into large outdoor group pens. There are free stalls for some of the older springy heifers, and then the bedded pack barn for calving. So there's a mixture of different housing systems, and all of these costs have been derived from published cost estimates. Labor is quite simply put in as an hourly wage, and we use published estimates in terms of the amount of labor required by stage. So the model is divided into stages based on the major management needs, such as the feeding, housing, and breeding needs. And if you see the color pattern here, that blue is the conventional and that green is an intensive. I maintain that same color pattern throughout to make it a little easier to identify the two different systems. But stage one is essentially the hutch calves. So we think about this as calves that are birth or really 24 hours old up until 63 days. And then they go into stage two, which is the small group hens for 2 months. And then we have stage three, essentially for heifers that are 4 to 10 months of age. Stage four is what we refer to as the pre-breeding stage. Heifers go in at 10 months, but heifers come out at different ages. And the reason for that is that heifers reach a different size, frame, weight, based on the management system. So the conventional system heifers take about 2 months longer to reach the same breeding size as the intensive program. Hence, the length of time for this stage is different for the two programs. Once they are inseminated, they go into stage 5, which is the post-breeding. Now, stage 5 and stage 6 are exactly the same length by program, so the conventional intensive in stage 5 is the same length, but the ages from which they enter and exit are different. Stage 6, the close-up pen or Springer pen, is the final 2 months, and it's final 2 months for both conventional and intensive. So this is the layout. Now, differences after 10 months, again, just as a reminder, those differences in stage 4 are due to differences in age at first service, which is based on the size at which, the age at which they attain the proper size for breeding. The times for stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 are exactly the same. The length of time in stage 5 is the same, and the length of time in stage 6 is the same across the two programs. Stage 4 is the only one that differs. If we look at the growth curves that we use in the model, I need to take a second to explain that, but the blue line represents the conventional curve. Its average daily gain from birth to calving is about 1.58 pounds per day. Now, it is based upon published estimates primarily from the Northeast. It's a blend of the average of the median growth curves in the Penn State data and the 75th percentile. So you could think about this as average to a little bit above average. The intensive, the green dotted line, has an average daily gain across the entire time period of 1.91 pounds per day. It's a blend that represents about 50% from private herd data collected out west using data collected by Bob Corbett from a private herd. 25% is based on the same 75th percentile as the conventional, and 25% in weighting is given to the 95th percentile of that same data set. So the intensive is actually a blend of 3 different sources of materials, and the conventional is a blend of 2. But these are based heavily on published information out of Penn State, and then the intensive has the extra benefit of having some private herd data blended in as well. The feed intake predictions, as I've mentioned previously, are based on nutrient requirements that have been published, and it's a function of the body weight of the heifer and the energy density of the feed being provided to the calves. Now, these growth stages I mentioned earlier have period-specific mortality risk. So if you look at the conventional program, it starts out with a pre-weaning mortality risk of about 7%. Goes down in stage 2, down in stage 3, and then stage 4, 5, and 6 is very low. And if you look at an overall weighted average mortality risk, it's just under 12%. The intensive has a lower mortality risk, specifically in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then it's assumed to be the same for stage 4, 5, and 6 as the conventional. And its average weighted mortality risk is 6.3%. And these numbers are adapted from various sources, including the National Animal Health Monitoring Services survey from 2007, but also on some Corbett data from the West, and clinical experiences as well. The morbidity risk, each stage again has its own set risk for the risk of diarrhea occurring in an animal or the risk of respiratory disease. So in stage 1, you can see that the estimate is set up that 40% of the conventional calves would have a case of scours, and 35% of the conventional calves would have a case of respiratory disease, compared to only 16% scours in the intensive and 14% in respiratory in the intensive. The cost for that, shown as 1743 versus 697, is not the impact of disease per se. That's assumed to already be encompassed in the growth curves themselves, but it's actually the cost of treatment for those diseases on a per calf basis on average. As you go into stage 2, we have a reduction in risk of disease, and now scours risk goes away. It is all respiratory disease. Stage 3, again, is respiratory disease. And 4, 5, 6, the same thing. But you see the risk go down significantly across there. Now, the data behind these estimates, again, came from NOMS 2007, but also came from clinical experience, from private herd data, and put together standard treatment protocols that would be the same across the 2 programs, but it would vary based on the size of the calf and the actual antimicrobial used. So again, quick reminder before we look at some specific values that all the costs I show you, whether it's by growth stage or grand total cost, are adjusted to a per surviving heifer basis. So for example, let's look at a scenario where we have 10 calves that enter the hutches at 24 hours of age. 9 calves do well, they survive, and they move on to the next stage. And let's assume, just for argument's sake, that the cost per calf is $297. Now, 1 calf, unfortunately, dies the day before they're scheduled to move out of the hutch. That calf had a cost incurred of $293. So now if I look at the net cost per surviving calf, I take 9 times 297 plus the 293 divided by the 9 survivors. So now the average cost per surviving calf that goes from stage 1 to stage 2 would be 329 and not the 297. And that reflects the cost incurred by the animal that calved, but now has to be borne by those that survive. So if we start looking at some of the assumptions used in the model, I start off with a newborn or wet calf heifer value of $200. Now, I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is assumed to be a Holstein model. Everything in here is set up for Holstein growth curves and Holstein intakes, and it's not currently set up for Jerseys or crossbreds, but $200 Holstein calf that has a birth weight of 88 pounds. We set as a target a breeding weight of 850 pounds. And that is meant to reflect adequate frame, and adequate frame for breeding for me would be 51 inches at withers height. Throughout the model, I refer to weight at breeding. But please make sure you don't misunderstand me. I'm not basing everything on weight, but from a modeling perspective, it's much easier to talk about body weight than to simply model height along with the weight. But my assumption is that by selecting for a breeding weight of 850 pounds, I'm assuming we've got a well-grown framey heifer that meets that 51-inch withers height as well. We should always be aware of height and not just weight when we start looking at breeding decisions. The labor cost per hour is $14. The interest cost I'm using is 6%. The AI cost per service is $18, and that includes the cost of semen, the straws, the equipment, and time. And then milk price, to understand the value of the extra milk in first lactation, seem to be $18 per hundredweight. In stage 1, this is the milk feeding stage. So these are the hutch calves, and these calves are in there from 24 hours of age up to about 63 days, so the first 2 months. The conventional program receives a 2020 milk replacer at the feeding rate of 1 pound of powder per gallon of final solution. And the cost input for it right now is $53. The intensive program is a 28-18 milk replacer. It's fed at a higher rate, and it has a higher cost. If we look at the actual feeding schedule, the conventional program receives 1 pound of powder per day for 49 days, and then weaning occurs. The intensive program receives 1.25 pounds of powder per day for the first 7 days. That goes up to 1.75 gallons of a solution containing 1.25 pounds per gallon. So the total amount being fed in intensive is significantly higher. And then in the last 7 days prior to weaning, the intensive heifers are cut in half in terms of the volume being provided. And when it's all said and done, the intensive heifers received almost double the amount of milk powder as the conventional program. So 95 pounds of powder versus 49 pounds. The average gallon per day is 1 versus 1.55, and the total cost for this milk feeding program is $52 versus $129. During the same stage, the calves are offered calf starter. The conventional calf starter is a 20% calf starter, and the intensive is 22, and you can see the cost. If we look at the actual projected intakes, these intakes are based on published research, and these are not modeled in terms of guesstimates. They're actually put in as hardwired estimates. But the first 7 days for either program, you see very, very little intake. We expect calves to eat very little in the first 7 days. If you look at the conventional program, they're not getting as much milk, and they tend to start eating starter earlier. And so over the next 6 weeks, the average per day over that time period, so again, ranging from a little over a tenth up until that last week, they're averaging 2.4 pounds per day. And then the last 2 weeks, when the milk's cut back or removed, they're up to 4.4 pounds on average per day. The intensive, because they're receiving a lot more than nutrients from milk, start at a low level of intake, maintain a fairly low level of intake for the next 5 weeks, and then as the weaning process starts, their intakes dramatically increase. So that by the time they're actually weaned, they're eating similar levels, if not more, on a per day in the last week of grain feeding compared to the conventional. When you look at the total time period, the conventional has a higher level of total starter intake, 165 versus 109 for the intensive. Moving, the summarizing of the first stage, again, these are the hutch calves. I've got in the feeding area, I've got colostrum, I've got the milk I just reviewed with you in the starter. The colostrum is not put in as a, it's not like I'm buying colostrum in the model, but the cost here reflects the labor to harvest, to pasteurize, to prepare it, and to feed it. And the difference in the cost of 22 versus 21 reflects a little bit higher mortality cost than the conventional, which yields a higher cost per heifer on average for the colostrum feeding. So if we look at the total feed cost for hutch calves, it's $100 for the conventional program, and it's $170 for the intensive. And again, the big difference there is the milk replacer. Next, we get into the labor, the vet med health treatments, the housing and bedding cost, and the interest cost. And so these categories will remain the same as I go through subsequent stages. The total cost per day, total cost for the stage, $242 for the conventional, $298 for the intensive, and the cost per day of $384 versus $474. Now, if we look at the cost, including the wet calf, we're at $459 versus $507. The conventional and intensive heifers enter at 88 pounds, but the conventional programs leave stage 1 weighing 167 for an average daily gain of 1.25. In the intensive program, heifers leave at 198 for an average daily gain of 1.75. The second stage is that grower stage where heifers are fed a mixture of grower grain and hay. They start out with 90% grower grain and move to 80% grower grain, and the remainder is hay. So we see the grain cost, conventional versus intensive, and the hay cost. So the hay cost is a little bit different between the two, but I'm not showing the decimal points. The intensive program eats a little bit more hay because of the body weight, but it just doesn't show up here because I'm only showing, I'm not showing any significant digits. The total feed cost, 53 versus 63. Again, we have our labor, vet med health, our housing and other costs, bedding cost, and our interest cost. So our total cost here in this stage, 107 versus 114, cost per day, only 182 versus 193. And if we look at the average daily gain for this stage, 199 versus 2.16, if we look at the cumulative from birth, total costs and cost per day, you can see those of 292 versus 343. And now looking at cumulative cost from birth, including wet calf, we're at 581 versus 631. And again, these are adjusted for death loss occurring along the way. Moving into the third stage, 4 to 10 months of age, we're now feeding a TMR. But the TMR has a little bit higher level of metabolizable protein in the intensive than in the conventional, but otherwise very, very similar. So we have a higher cost for that, plus we have a heifer that's bigger that's eating a bit more. And that explains the difference in the feed cost. Total cost per day, we're about $25 higher on the intensive. Even though we're in there for the same length of time, the cost per day is a bit higher. But we also have a heifer coming out at the end of this. It's about 80 pounds heavier than the conventional. And so we have also a little higher average daily gain during this stage. And cumulative from birth, we got an average cost now of 248 versus 276, and the cost to get to 10 months of 989 versus 1061. This moves us to the fourth stage, and this stage, remember, has a different length of time, and a different length of time is different because of the differences in the time at which it requires the heifer to get to certain breeding size. So this one's not as easy to compare side by side because there's so many things that are different. So I won't spend too much time on this. But over this entire fourth stage, we've got an average daily gain here of about 1.6 versus 1.9, cost per day of 210 versus 232. And at the end of this, we've got a cost that's very similar, $14.75 versus $14.46. But we've got an animal leaving the intensive program at 15.3 months, weighing 1,012 pounds, whereas the conventional heifer, it leaves 2 months later at 17.4 months, and it weighs less at 983 pounds. Now, from a reproductive management perspective, I'm assuming that the heifers have 8 cycles of opportunity. I know that's too many, but when I started doing this, that's kind of what was pretty typical for typically observed in the field. But in both programs, the reproductive performance is assumed to be the same. There's an average insemination risk, or think about heat detection intensity, of about 68%. The average conception risk over all the cycles is 55%. Those are the same. What is different is that we have a slightly different population at risk that comes in. We have a slightly different population that leaves. We have slightly different numbers of animals that remain open at the end. And so if we actually look at the average breeding cost per head, it's virtually identical. What happens though is we have a slight difference in the net cost for the culls, the heifers that fail to get pregnant. And if we assume that an open heifer is bringing in $1 per pound, we can see that the net cost for culls per heifer finished is slightly lower for the intensive program than it is for the conventional program, $18.75 versus $21.77. So that's reflected into this stage 5. So now we also have, in addition to the feed, the labor, the vet med, we have the value of the reproductive culls. So the reproductive culls are sold to create gross revenue. And that's reflected here as a negative value coming back in, because that's actually money coming into the program. So the intensive heifers weigh a little bit more, so they command a little bit more money, $42 on average versus $39 on a per heifer basis. And if we look at the total cost per day, $356 versus $370. And now as we head to the Springer pen, we got a conventional heifer weighing 1222 and an intensive heifer weighing 1322. So 100-pound advantage for the intensive, and yet she's about 2 months younger. And cumulative cost to date, $1893 versus $1876. This final stage, the Springer stage, we have an uptick in the vet med health costs, but it's not because of disease. It's just that this is where a lot of vaccinations are given. So that's reflected in that $14 per animal cost. Both groups are receiving a similar TMR here, and our total cost is similar, $261 versus $272. Now I said a similar TMR, but remember the intensive heifers are larger, so they're eating more. And that explains the $10 extra in the feed cost. At the end of this stage, so at the day of calving, just before she drops her calf, she's got the conventional heifer is at $12.97, the intensive heifer is at $14.25. So in this stage, that's an average daily gain of 1.2 versus 1.69. But if we look at now the cumulative cost average per day of $249 versus $273, and our total cost, including the wet calf, of $21.63 versus $21.56. So a very similar total cost across the entire growing period for conventional versus intensive, but yet the intensive is coming in at about 2 months earlier time period than the conventional. If we look at this from a table perspective figure here, we've got two different things being shown. First, in the upright bars, the blue versus green bars, that's showing the cumulative cost by age, but this does not include the wet calf value. The lines with the points on top that are connected reflects those same costs, but also adds back in the costs associated with the wet calf. And so what you can see, regardless of which one you look at, is that the intensive program carries a higher cost early. It maintains a higher cost per stage across the entire time period, but it stops incurring costs roughly 2 months before the conventional heifer. And so the conventional heifer catches up with costs and actually slightly surpasses it, but that's 2 months down the road. If we break out the cost by category, we can see that the wet calf, again, this is an interest adjusted value. Remember, they both started out at $200, but by the time we get to the calving time period, the wet calf value for the conventional is $264 and for the intensive is $247. So that's reflecting interest differences as well as mortality differences. We have an interest cost of $113 versus $106. Housing of $250 versus $239, and that's reflecting more than anything else 2 months less total housing time. We've got a cull income difference. We've got a breeding management that's basically identical. We got health and vet med costs that are higher for the conventional because we had a higher morbidity level, higher level of sickness. Labor is higher for the conventional because, again, more time in the raising operation. The only thing where the intensive is actually higher would be in the feed. And so there's a higher feed cost of $12.36 estimated versus $11.66. So these bigger heifers that are growing faster consume more feed per day, even though the total number of days is less. This table I'm not going to spend any time on, but it's just simply summarizing everything we've just gone over and put it all into one table. It's a nice table to go back just to kind of get a quick overview of what's happening across time. But if you look at the lower right corner, you can see the 2163 versus 2156 that we described as being the cost of the conventional versus intensive. Now, how do these estimates compare to other models? I mentioned the Carsey's model to start with. In that model, that paper, they reported an average daily gain of 1.75. In this one, we've got a conventional of 1.58 and intensive 1.91. And if we do a blended average, we're going to be pretty close to the Carsey's publication. Feed to gain, 8.5 versus 10.2 and 8.9. The stars beside mine indicate we've got mortality adjustments taking place, and I'm not sure if Jason actually has a mortality adjustment in that paper. Average dry matter intake of 15.2 versus 16.2 versus 17. You see a feed cost per day, feed cost per pound of gain, and total costs. So the estimates reported here are very similar to what's been reported elsewhere. Now, one of the things that's nice that needs to be remembered and considered when we look at an intensive heifer program is understanding how fast the cycle turns and how many heifers we actually have to place in order to meet our needs. If we have an intensive heifer program, we're going to move heifers through the program faster. In this case, it's about 2 months faster, and we have a lower mortality risk. The combination of those two things suggests that we don't need to place as many heifers in order to have the same number of replacements generated at the end. If we focus on the column that has a 36% culling risk, we can see that we need about 360 replacements per year for this hypothetical dairy. If I'm running a conventional heifer operation, I need to place about 34 heifers per month into the hutches as wet calves. And at any given time, my average heifer inventory is about 761 animals. If we compare that to the intensive program, I could place about 2 heifers less per month. At any given time, I'm going to have a slightly smaller heifer inventory of 696, but yet I meet my same exact number of heifers calving, but because I do it more quickly, more efficiently, I don't have to have as many animals in the system. Now, if you use an intensive system, that's something you could consider doing. But alternatively, you could continue to place the same number of heifers and then make culling decisions on your own across the growing phases to try to keep only the better growing, better quality heifers, which actually increases their value even more. Alternatively, you could raise all the heifers and sell some to your neighbor as springers, for example. But it creates opportunities that perhaps you didn't have before with the conventional program. So that's one of the other nice benefits of an intensive program. Finally, what I'll talk about is the value associated with extra milk. Fernando Soberón and Mike Van Amberg at Cornell have published several papers looking at the impact of more intensive growth on first lactation performance. And one of their estimates looked at the impact of pre-weaning daily gain on first lactation performance. And in their analysis, they found this prediction equation, which essentially says that for every kilo of more average daily gain, they could expect about 1,551 kilos more milk. Or for every pound additional average daily gain, could expect another 1,551 pounds of first lactation milk. If we follow that equation and look at the extra average daily gain modeled in the intensive program of about half a pound, that's at about 780 pounds more milk for first lactation. Now, if we go through the mathematics and assume an interest rate of 6%, a marginal milk value or quantity of 2.36 pounds per pound of feed intake, and a milk price of 18 cents per pound, we can come up with a marginal milk net value of about 14 cents per pound once we account for the feed necessary to produce it. So therefore, the net value of the extra marginal milk, 780 pounds, is about $105 per heifer. Now that milk will be created or produced across lactation. So what we have to do is do a time value adjustment back to the day of calving. And that's what the $99 represents. So we lose about $6 with the time value adjustment. And then the other thing we have to remember is that not every heifer that calves is going to stay in the herd for the full first lactation. So what I've done is just put in a number. I'm assuming 28% of my first lactation animals leave the herd prior to end of first lactation, which means that 72% are expected to realize the full benefit of $99, and 28% may only see about half of that. So consequently, the estimated average value of extra milk per heifer is about $85, adjusted to day of calving. So if we summarize these results by stage, we see the investment cost, we see the initial weight, we see lots of other values, but I just want to draw your attention to a few really important ones. Total rearing cost per heifer, including the deads and the culls, but not assigning a wet calf value, we're at $18.99 for the conventional system and $19.09 for the intensive system. If we put in that wet calf investment cost and then total that up, we're at $21.63 versus $21.56. And then finally, if we look at subtracting from the intensive system the value that we predict would be realized by extra milk production of $85, we come to a net cost per heifer of $21.63 versus $2,071. So the net positive for the intensive would be a predicted profit of about $92 per heifer that calves into the system. Now, when we think about this, there's some key drivers behind the heifer raising cost. One would be the wet calf value. One would be the weight at first service. And I'll go through some of this with you very quickly. Another thing would be the growth rate and efficiency of growth. Fourth would be feed cost. And fifth would be mortality. And all five of these things are considered big drivers behind influencing the cost to raise calves. So I'm going to conclude the webinar with just a couple of sensitivity tables to try to show you kind of comparative cost associated with a few changes in some of those inputs. In this first table, if you first focus on this bold number kind of in the center, 2,156, that's our current estimated cost per heifer calving in the intensive. And so that reflects a wet calf value of $200 and a weight at first service of 850 pounds. Now, if you're content at having a lighter heifer at breeding, you can just move up that $200 column and see that at 800 pounds, it's $2,080 would be the predicted cost to raise a heifer. If you think that I'm good with 850 pounds at first service, but I think my heifers are worth more, and I go to the right and I can see at $350 heifers, the cost now is $23.41. So that's how the sensitivity table works. It allows you to look at two different changes going on simultaneously. The next sensitivity analysis is around the wet calf value on the left-hand axis and the cost of feed across the top. Now the feed cost adjustment is a mathematical adjustment, but essentially what I'm saying is I'm taking milk, starter grain components, grower grain components, the TMR components, all the feeding components in there, and I'm adjusting those costs up or down 5, 10, 20%. And so if we look at this and say, what happens if I've got a wet calf at $200 and I'm using my current cost, I'm at $21.56. Well, what happens if feed cost is actually 10% lower? Then that results in a savings or lower cost per heifer calving now of about $2,028 versus a $21.56. So feed cost has an important role, but it's not everything. It is a large driver. And if feed costs, for example, were reduced 20%, now we're lowering the cost of raising down to about $1,900 for the same wet calf value of $200. If we look at wet calf, holding the wet calf value constant, but look at a change in proportional mortality adjustment, This gets to be a little bit more complicated, but this is a proportional adjustment where 100% is equivalent to the weighted average of 6.3%. 50% adjustment means that 6.3% is reduced by half, so it's at 3.2%. So for example, at 100% mortality, that's current 100% mortality adjustment, which reflects 6.3% total mortality in the intensive program, an 850-pound weight at first service, we got $2,156 cost of rearing. If my mortality was reduced in half, my cost per heifer calving would be lowered from $2,156 to $2,132. And that's how this sensitivity table works. Finally, we look at changing the conception risk and the insemination risk. So in the lower right side, you can see with the 68% insemination risk and average 55% conception risk, you see where we are with the $2,156 cost of rearing. If we had some reproductive challenges and our insemination risk was only 53% and our conception risk was only 40%, we can see that we're raising the cost of rearing a heifer. $2,287 is that cost versus the $2,156. So you can see that all of these different inputs have an impact on the expected cost for raising heifers. So just to finish up, we've tried to represent the cost and benefits as closely as possible. There are lots of different approaches to raising heifers, and they can vary tremendously based on labor, feed, housing, and so forth. It's quite possible, in fact, highly likely, that your individual operation will vary significantly from what we have covered in the model. Some people do a lot of pasture-based work. Some people may have dry lots, but this is an honest attempt at trying to compare two similar programs using the same housing, the same types of feeds, where we only tweak the nutrients a little bit. As we get more and more hard data for actual inputs for different specific systems, we could probably improve the accuracy of the modeling a bit more and increase the accuracy and reliability of the estimates we're generating. And of course, individual results may vary, but we feel pretty comfortable we're representing what we think is a fairly typical heifer operation within the design of this model. So in summary, the cost of raising heifers is typically higher than most producers realize when we actually consider all the inputs and opportunities. We have to consider the cost incurred by heifers that die or are sold. Failure to do this was going to lead to an underestimate of the true cost of raising heifers. The spreadsheet model, I think, is consistent with published results. It demonstrates the cost and the value of using a more intensive approach. The intensive approach does have a higher cost per day, but results in a lower total cost and greater value. There are lots of different factors that impact the heifer raising costs, and we just highlighted a few through the sensitivity analyses today. But regardless of what we've shown, the feed cost continues to be the single highest source of cost for raising heifers, and typically the second highest, at least in this estimate, is labor. So with that, I thank you for joining us for the webinar today. I hope this has been helpful to you, and hope we've stimulated some thought and will serve to help you do a better job of analyzing your own heifer costs and opportunities. Thanks.